I want to offer you a warm thanks to all of those of you here attending in the audience for joining us today. And that includes the 20 plus people who are online zooming in. It's really exciting that we have so many people who are interested in Andrew's talk today. My name is Dwayne Corpus. Most of you probably know that. I'm an associate professor of history and the humanities here at NYU Shanghai. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Professor Andrew Hui, who joins us from Singapore today, where he currently teaches at Yale-NUS. Professor Hui received his PhD from Princeton University in comparative literature, and though he rightly describes himself as a literary scholar, he is also in many ways interested in cultural history, in philosophy, in art history, and he has training both in the European literary tradition as well as training in the field of sinology. His research interests focus on how classical traditions of antiquity served as a kind of archive for knowledge production during early modern Europe and the global Renaissance. And among a multitude of exciting research questions that he's posed over the course of his career so far, he's especially fascinated by the ways that ideas given shape in poetic topoi, in visual imagery, or in symbolic expressions are transmitted across very vast expanses of geography and time periods. His books have investigated, for instance, the cultural discourse of ancient ruins in Renaissance literature, the literary form of the aphorism from Confucius to Twitter, from Buddha to the Bible, and from Heraclitus to Nietzsche. And in his forthcoming book, which I am super excited to read, I think Amazon said it's coming out in December, right? As soon as it comes out, I'm going to have it on my desk, is about the intimate space of personal libraries and studies, which extends from the real and imagined libraries of Renaissance figures like Petrarch, Machiavelli, Montaigne, Cervantes, Rabelais, and Shakespeare to include comparative reflections on Islamic, Mughal, and Chinese book cultures, as well as modern authors like Jorge Luis Borges and Umberto Eco. I know you're going to not like hearing this, but I have a personal investment in this topic because my library is currently in storage in Ithaca because I moved to Cornell. I have about, I don't know, 2,500 books in storage, and it pains me to think about them and them not being part of my life here. But I am a book collector in that sense. So I'm really looking forward to that book. But what impresses me is his scope, because it's not only temporally and geographically expansive, but also intellectually expansive. My admiration of his scholarly imagination is mirrored by many others, because he's received a number of really prestigious fellowships, including the Young Researchers Award from the National University of Singapore, the Berenson Fellowship at the Villa Itati in Florence, and fellowships at the Whitney Humanities Center at Yale, as well as the Berlin Institute for Advanced Study this past year, which is where I had the chance to meet Andrew for the first time. He's embarking on a new project, a very new project. Actually, he's embarking on about 5 new projects, but this one is about the transcultural transactions and transmissions attached to the early modern Jesuit missions in China, which is the topic of his presentation today: Garden, Labyrinth, Ruin, the Jesuits in the Qing court. Professor Hui will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Andrew to NYU Shanghai.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, this is better. I'm actually going to speak a little bit sotto voce because I took a red eye from Singapore to Shanghai just yesterday. And so as you can hear, my voice is a bit hoarse. But thank you so much. I'm really honored and delighted to be here. This is really my first time back to China in over 20 years, when I studied, probably like many of you, intensive modern and classical Chinese. So this project is East and West, and West and East. And this is a Chengyu that I learned recently in my Chinese lessons. So I hope this is not 班门弄斧, right? I'm not bringing owls to Athens or coals to Newcastle, to use another literary allusion. So I will just plunge into my talk, and I think, thank you, Wayne, for that very generous description. And this project is very much in spirit and theme like my previous projects, which is about classical topos, ideas and imageries from the classical tradition, from antiquity that spread itself, proliferated in different times and spaces. And I will think about these three topoi: garden, labyrinth, and ruin. So in 1747, 12 years into his 61-year reign, the Emperor Tianlong came across an engraving of a European fountain. Impressed by its fusion of art and engineering, he commissioned two Jesuits, Giuseppe Castiglione and Michel Benoit, to design a series of Western buildings in the Yuan Palace. The result is this: Xiyang Lou, or Mansions of the Western Ocean, a mishmash of Renaissance, Baroque, Rococo styles with Chinese characteristics thrown in, all tucked into the northeastern corner of this vast garden compound on Beijing's outskirts. Has anybody been here? A couple? Okay, I'm gonna visit this for the first time on Thursday. So the Western Garden is this red part here, and this is blocking it, but it's outside the city walls, and the Forbidden City there, and Yangmingwen is there. Okay, so originally established by the Emperor Kangxi as a private gift to his fourth son, the future Yongzheng Emperor, Yuan expanded over the generations, with each Qing emperor adding exquisite gardens, lakes, and pavilions that transformed it into a microcosm of imperial life. More than a mere retreat, Yuan solely displaced the Forbidden City as the center of court life. It buzzed with the daily rhythm of bureaucratic shuffles, opulent ceremonies, and the inevitable inner chamber intrigues that arose between the Manchu family and their vast entourage of concubines and eunuchs. For Tianlong, the estate held a personal significance. There he was born and raised, and it was in the Peony Pavilion where the 12-year-old met his grandfather, the Emperor Kangxi, for the very first time. The boy dazzled him by flawlessly reciting a Song Dynasty lyric on the love of the lotus. From that moment, his destiny was sealed. When Tianlong ascended to the throne, he wanted to leave his own mark on the garden. His major contribution was the Western Gardens, the Xiyang Lou. Arrayed in meticulous order, the faux European garden stood like foreign guests beside pagodas, the facades and flourishes in odd contrast to the winding lakes and curved bridge that bordered them. In one pavilion, jets of water erupted from these bronze mouths of the Chinese zodiac figures and flowed into the scalloped, lotus-flowered pool. Inside another, the emperor had rooms filled with European gadgets, clocks with finely tuned mechanisms that told the hours with a kind of precision that spoke to the progress of another civilization. There were also automata, clever devices, birds that sang for a moment and then fell silent. And nested deep within this Xiyang Lou was another ingenious handiwork. So this is the main object of attention for my talk this afternoon, a Western maze. So you might think, what is this Western maze doing in a Chinese garden? That's precisely my research question. And since Yuan, as you probably know, is in ruins because of the burning of the Anglo-French troops in the Second Opium War in 1860, our knowledge of its condition is mainly through a set of engravings, which you see here. So in this engraving, what we can see is the axonometric view of the maze. It's a mixture, as you can see, of Eastern and Western aesthetics. There's a formal symmetry to it all. The pagoda, as you see, is in the center, and it's enveloped by paths of loops, dead ends, crossroads, and quadrants where there are cul-de-sacs of bamboo groves. And it's all framed by a water moat, rocks, and trees. Um, uh, and behind the pavilion is where the Emperor Tianlong kept his Zhong, the Western clocks and automata and other curiosities from the West. And instead of the usual green hedges that you see in Western mazes, what you have here is a stone masonry barrier, and it's about chest high. The labyrinth thus encapsulates the harmony of opposites in both European and Chinese cosmology: lines and circles, artifice and nature, discovery and concealment. In form and history, the maze is an enigma. Archaeologists and mythographers record that complex networks of interconnected pathways had existed in Minoan and Egyptian civilizations. Daedalus was said to have built an inescapable maze for the Minotaur to entrap him. Virgil in the Aeneid describes the Cretan creation as woven of blind walls, its paths an enigma of 1,000 forking ways that foiled all clues. And then in the Middle Ages, the circular labyrinth was purified from Daedalus' profane contraption and made by church authorities and really allegorized into the soul's convoluted pathways towards God. So this is the labyrinth in the central nave of Chartres Cathedral in France. It also appeared in the parchment of illuminated manuscripts. And so the circular labyrinth here functions as a cosmological diagram that demonstrates God as the ultimate artifacts. And then in the Renaissance, mazes became secularized and adorned the pleasure gardens of the elite. And technically, English mazes are multicursal labyrinths, whereas labyrinths in the English language, it's unicursal, right? So this is a maze, this here is a labyrinth, right? One is rectilinear, the other is circular. But basically in French and Italian, you have Labyrinth and Labyrinto. And so I'm just going to use this interchangeably in my talk. And a host of early modern philosophers, from Francis Bacon to Descartes, from Leibniz to D'Alembert, used the metaphor of the labyrinths to describe the mysteries of nature that required decipherment by the rational mind. So, in its manifold plea, folds that explicate, replicate, and complicate, the Leibniz is that Leibnizian monad par excellence. It was after a sojourn in the gardens of Herrenhausen that inspired the German polymath to write, "Each portion of matter may be conceived as like a garden full of plants and like a pond full of fishes. But each branch of every plant and every member of every animal, each drop of its liquid parts is also some garden and pond." So gardens within gardens, mazes within mazes, plants within plants. These are images that Leibniz uses to describe the factual nature of the world. And you can see already in some of my illustrations how the labyrinth is a microcosm. It's a fractal of all of the parts and the holes contained in the parts. So as it happens, deep within the structure of Chinese thought are also, as you know very well, are symbols that seek to represent the interconnectedness of all things. The hexagrams from the ancient classic I Ching also resembles the iterative patterns of a maze, with the former's horizontal broken or continuous lines and the latter's passages and intersections as both an expression of what is called ars combinatoria, the combinatory arts. And this is actually what powers algorithm machines even today. It's all binaries, 0 and 1s, right? And so, interestingly, both the figure of the maze and hexagrams fascinated Leibniz. He received his information about this ancient divination manual from his correspondences with the Jesuits in China, most notably Father Joachim Bouvet. And the character for longevity show. And this was in my parents' rosewood furniture when I was growing up in a Dallas suburb in Texas. So it's been long stylized into hundreds of different forms. And here you can very see it has a maze-like formation. And so in the Ming period, countless ornamental patterns of shou, as you see here, became a favorite decorative motif and adorned dresses, gifts, furnitures, and furnishings. And the elegant windows and thresholds in the houses of elites, you can see this in Suzhou and everywhere in China, were decorated with refined lattice patterns of the bewildering algorithmic complexity, a profusion of maze-like honeycomb loops, interlocking parallelograms, and cellular replications. So if we combine all these things together, the modular design of shou, of hexagram, of these window lattices, all these are forms of matrix. They exemplify what the sinologist Lothar Lederhosen has identified as a principle, a fundamental Chinese design principle. Minute variations of a master pattern proliferates into the Wanwu, the 10,000 things, a vast network that extends to items such as Chinese characters, terracotta soldiers, bronze vessels, interior decorations, and even the cascade of cookie cutter menus in Chinatown all over the world. Do you want chicken with broccoli, pork with broccoli, chicken with snow peas, beef with snow peas, shrimp with snow peas, black bean chicken, black bean pork, black bean beef? It's all part of one Wu, right? Okay, so when the Chinese, when the Western Jesuits then introduced Western aesthetics principles into this Chinese garden, they grafted this new feature into an already established cultural matrix. The maze was a microcosm embedded within the macrocosm of Yuan Mingyuan, which in itself encapsulated in miniature the principles of Chinese garden aesthetics and empire building. Interestingly, the name of this maze is called Wanwu Zhen, right? So the 10,000 flower complex, which perhaps points out the similarities between the radiating petals of a flower and the bifurcating paths of a maze. And from this, we can see how there's a synthesis between Western metaphysical thought and Chinese cosmology, as they're reflected in the broader cultural exchanges that characterized the Jesuit missionary in the Qing court. For what they did was try to harmonize Christian and Confucian ideas through the language of universal reason. Now, Chinese cosmology envisions the world as an intricate web of stimuli and responses, 感应. The Chinese text Lu Shi Chunzhou suggests that strum a gong note and the other gong will resonate. If you strum a juan note, the other juan won't vibrate. So what you have here is a system of correlative relationships. And it's precisely this Western maze that found a sympathetic harmony in the Chinese garden. In its web of interconnected paths, the maze is a sort of cross-cultural 感应, for it resonated with the Chinese idea that organizes the universe through a series of affinities, similar to the Western idea of, in esotericism, called the signature of all things, right? It's what the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben calls this thick plot of resemblances and sympathies, analogies, and correspondences that connects all things with all. Moreover, the maze, through its name of myriad flowers, Wanhua, invites us to reflect an interplay between the world of the 10,000 things and the unity and the vision of unity in multiplicity. For each flower or each branch is a discrete unit of the maze that reflects a part of the greater whole. Now, Qianlong's Occidental playland had but a short life. In the Second Opium War of 1860, the garden was looted and burned down by a coalition of Anglo-French troops led by Lord James Bruce, the 8th Earl of Elgin, whose father, guess who his father was? His father happens to be Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin, who had ordered the removal of the Pantheon marbles, which now is still in the British Museum 60 years earlier in 1801. So clearly, there is some patterns of cultural appropriation that runs through the house of the Lord of Elgin. In any case, since then, the Yuanmingyuan, you can see here, has been a site of ruin. It's been a warehouse for spolia. It's a farmland, a garbage dump, a university campus, amusement park, and now it's a UNESCO heritage site. So So whereas the hulking chunks of stones from the Rococo pavilions are charged with the nostalgia of imperial twilight, scattered on the grounds like that of the Roman Forum in Italy, the maze was completely rebuilt in the 1980s, and you can still spend some time wandering through it. Okay, so Yuanmingyuan, as I said, was designed as a microcosm of the empire that recreated its monumental landscapes in miniature. Connected by a tissue of lakes and streams and bridges and grottos, each cluster of gardens had its own microecology and elusive histories. Its highest point was named after Kunlun, the immense mountain ranges in the Tibetan plateau, reputed to be the axis of the world in Chinese mythology. The 9 small islands in the central lake was called the Jiuzhou, the 9 regions, for the traditional concepts of the 9 territorial divisions of the world. And to the east were 3 islands that represented the mythical islands of the immortals. Now, during their reigns, the Qing emperors would regularly make inspection tours to the south. Kangxi and Qianlong, they actually loved the Suzhou Gardens, which you can take a train to. It's just about an hour from Shanghai. They were filled with classical allusions and rocky cliffs, vegetations, and miniature monuments compressed into small plots of land. In 1771, Qianlong ordered from Suzhou a model of lion growth, a celebrated rock composition that exemplified these petrified forests here. You see here. Peacocks, pheasants, deer, and even elephants, were offered as tributes by rulers from Southeast Asia that roamed its ground. There was even a simulacrum of a typical Chinese village with silk workshops, theaters, markets, and schools that mimic the buzzing atmosphere of life outside the court. Here in its library, they had a complete copy of the Sikuochuan Shu, a imperially commissioned encyclopedia that was the largest work, that had the largest collection of books in Chinese history, comprising close to 40,000 volumes, or about 1 billion words. So flora and fauna, temples and texts were all brought together into this circumscribed space. Qianlong writes in a panegyric essay, "Here their heavenly treasures and earthly wonders truly gathered, and no imperial pleasure setting of the past can be compared with it." Now, the Jesuit garden was a thin strip of land in its northeast periphery. In one of the 34 volumes of Lettres édifiantes et curieuses, a series of missives in the 18th century that the Jesuits had sent back to Europe to record their sojourn in China, a missionary records, "The reigning emperor, a prince of genius, eager for knowledge, having seen in 1747 the picture of a fountain, asked Father Castiglione for the explanation of it, and if there was at court any European in a position to have made one similar to it. The missionary artist, whose modesty had made his talents so illustrious, realized the consequences of a positive reply and prudently limed himself by saying to His Majesty that he would immediately go and make inquiries in all the churches. But the emperor had scarcely retired when a eunuch came and said that if there was any European in a position to understand a fountain, he was to take him the next day to the palace. These last words in the language of the court were in order to find someone at any cost. No missionary had any doubt about it, and all eyes had been turned to Father Benoit. So, post haste, this small band of highly educated and highly motivated men got to work. They consulted books in their library of the Beitang Church, and there they had copies of Palladio, Vitruvius, and Sordilio. They brought in the newest technologies, their newest knowledge in technologies and mathematics, in hydraulics, architecture, and landscape engineering. And in their zeal, the Jesuits actually realized Leon Battista Alberti's ideal vision of the architect as the universal encyclopedic humanist, one in full command of all the arts of sciences, knowing the eternal cycles of the heavens above and the contingencies of the mutable earth below. In their global outreach, wherever they went, the Jesuits brought with them the aesthetics of the European Renaissance and incorporating the indigenous traditions of the local population, they transformed it into a global hybrid Baroque. True to the motto of omnia omnibus, all things to all people, they were versatile and adapted to their host. China was not the first time nor the last time that the Jesuits or the Baroque movement found itself transmuted by its surroundings. The soaring cathedrals of Mexico City or Cusco, for example, stood not merely as sites of worship, but also testaments to the might of Spain's empire. In Manila and Goa, the grandeur of Baroque churches like St. Augustine or Basilica of Bom Jesus represented a architectural hybrid. European religious motifs and tropical imageries were handcrafted with local materials and indigenous labor. So what is interesting then is that the art they produced in the Tianlong court was manifestly secular with no theological overtones at all. In imperial architecture of China, it always functioned as a mediation between the feng shui of cosmic forces. The Temple of Heaven was the axis mundi between heaven and earth. The Forbidden City is a nexus between the sovereign and his people. And the Rehe summer palace in Changde today was supposedly built on the mountain ridges where the dragon veins meet. Here, in the design of the Western Gardens, the Jesuits set their profession of faith to glorify God, for now they glorified the majesty. They mediated not the transcendental axis of the sacred and profane, but rather a horizontal network of East and West aesthetics. Gone were the drama, the rich dramas of biblical narratives. Instead, dense saintly iconography was now displaced by a celebration of imperial power. The making of the garden is not as a place of worship, but as a testament to worldly rule, then revealed this fundamental shift in the role of the Jesuits in the global cultural landscape. When Qianlong ordered the construction of his Western palaces, his power was climbing to its zenith. His military conquest expanded the boundaries of his realm to Mongolia, Turkestan, Qinghai, and Tibet. Qing cultural production endeavored to bring the furthest edges of the empire into the very center of the court. Qing emperors took on a multiplicity of cultural identities. In their official portraits, here you have Yongzheng, and this is depicted by Castiglione. He's here depicted as a Chinese literatus. He's depicted as a bowman. He's depicted as a Taoist sage. He's depicted as this European hunter here with the tiger there. You see in the third picture. So, and Qianlong himself self-fashioned himself as a Confucian connoisseur of antiques. He amassed a multitude of jade and ceramics, sacrificial vessels, and exquisite rolls of flowing calligraphy. Scale was paramount. In Chinese design, rocks and gardens evoked entire mountain ranges, and ponds contained vast oceans. In Qing horticulture, the art of miniature trees and landscapes, pangjing, otherwise known as bonsai in Japanese, reached its apotheosis. Qianlong's craftsmen constructed for him lacquered curio boxes. And here, this is the Zimingzhong. They were really, they were just fascinated by this here. So Qianlong's craftsmen constructed for him lacquered curio boxes with intricate compartments to store precious objects like precious jade, scholar's rocks, snuff bottles, carved rhinoceros horns, Buddhist figurines, tiny ink scrolls, and Western pocket watches. Called 多宝阁, these multi-tiered treasures are actually, I think, in my interpretation, quite reminiscent of labyrinths, for they concealed and revealed and they encapsulated an entire world of wonder within their layered confines. So in this absorptive energy of Qing cultural discourse, the empire became multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious. The imperial palaces of Yuanmingyuan, the Forbidden City, and Rehe Summer Retreat became cosmopolitan Wunderkammer, hosting artifacts and texts of the empire and beyond. And in the late 16th century, the entrance of Matteo Ricci had already brought in the texts of philosophy and theology. But also they brought maps and clocks, musical and scientific instruments to the court. Among the gifts the emperors were smitten by were these so-called self-sounding bells, these ziminggong, zhong, that the workshops of the imperial household was dedicated to the production of care of these mechanical clocks. The Qing court received tributaries from the secular rulers of Europe. Here, Henri Leonard Bertin, he was a minister of state under Louis the 15th and 16th, gifted to Qianlong an extraordinary selection of European handicrafts. And here, in the most impressive of all, in an act of brazen cross-cultural flattery, are 6 immense tapestries that illustrated of the glory of the Qing Empire a la Française. So no extant buildings were large enough to display these wall hangings. So these wall hangings were actually placed behind the maze in this observatory of distant sea, Yuanyingguan, which is put behind the maze. Okay, so now let's zoom out a little bit and think about the gardens, global gardens in the 18th century. In the 18th century, the gardens of several major Euro-Asian sovereigns, Mughal, French, Russians, Chinese, expressed their imperial aspirations of each state. To expand one's territory also means to condense it into an earthly paradise. That the contemporaries of Aurangzeb, Louis XIV, Peter the Great, and Kangxi made landscapes central to the exhibition of magnificence is no accident. By 1770, the French Jesuits repeatedly called Yuanmingyuan the Versailles of Beijing. In Versailles, the power of the absolute sovereign was expressed through the science of horticulture, the metaphysics of the infinite, and the finitude of human vision. The Sun King as Apollo and the Chinese emperor as the son of heaven must radiate the splendor that is befitting to their court. Versailles, naturally, had its own labyrinth, decorated with 39 fountains with sculptures that illustrated Aesop's fables. The landscape genius André Le Nôtre made it for the amusement and edification of Louis XIV's son, the young Dauphin. Charles Perrault, who modernized the ancient Greek writers' ancient animal tales, says it is called labyrinths because of its infinity of its paths, so tightly interwoven that it's impossible now to get lost. And in its design, this is my interpretation, Louis XIV's absolutist vision is revealed. A kingdom where nothing, not even the smallest fountain or the densest hedge, was left to chance. Even amusement was appropriated to moral utility. A fable begins but refuses to end, endlessly looping in your mind, yet everywhere path leads to power. If the Qianlong Emperor thought that he was imitating the Europeans, it actually turned out that Louis XIV was already imitating the Chinese. And here is an exemplary case of the chiasmus of China and Europe and China. This here is a recreation, and it was designed by Louis Levaux in 1668. It's called the Trianon de Porcelain, and it was a short-lived palace near Versailles, constructed in the manner of works from China. But this gesture was no innocent flirtation. It endured for decades and even centuries in different estate and country houses, and where pagodas, dragons, and Buddhas, and elements of decorative imaginary, these European fantasies about China and the actual distant empire refracted each other. Because what you have here is that imperial and commercial kilns made porcelain to satisfy European taste. Hence, the Trianon de Porcelain formalizes the distance between these worlds, even as it claimed to bridge them. So, the symbolic form of the labyrinth in both France and China distills and radiates all the grand themes of modernity, the relationship between perspective, orientation, and power. Louis' absolutism is expressed in the panoramic vistas of the landscape from the all-seeing perspectival eye, whose abstract visual domination reflects the totality of the king's divine and mortal status. That the labyrinth is found in these two imperial palaces manifests a tension between the human desire for order and the reality of a perplexing world. For the Qing ruler, his Western maze was not merely a place for play, but a demonstration of mastery. An encounter with foreignness is absorbed and assimilated without ceding authority. The labyrinth then becomes a potent metaphor for the way that power accommodates the unfamiliar, making the foreign legible without surrendering its own claim to mastery. Even in the most perplexing situations, someone always knows the way out. Now, in the Chinese tradition, to create a garden is to create a cosmology. The term to create a garden, 造yuan, echoes the phrase the creator or force of transformation, 造物 or 造hua in the Zhuangzi. The closest equivalent of the labyrinth in Chinese is 迷宫, or perplexing palace. In the Shuowen Jiezi, 迷 means perplexing, or even possible, or entanglement. And so, seen through this light, the maze represents not only enigma, but a metaphor for the cosmological belief that the universe, though vast and opaque, operates according to laws that can be deciphered. The fractal nature of the Western labyrinth also has certain resonances with Chinese horticulture. The classic gardens, particularly, as I said, the ones in Suzhou, placed a great emphasis on the manner of approach. The doorways and thresholds were fashioned in the shapes of the cycles of the moon or the curvatures of a vase. The direct path, of course, is convenient. Preferably, however, is the one that charts the circuitous routes of corridors, liminal zones, and zigzag bridges. Everything was about enfrainment. Pattern books advised on the tasteful arrangement of lattice windows and rhizomatic tiles. The careful modulated placement of rocks, corridors, and waterways heightened the pleasurable sense of delay and surprise for the visitor as they took on each view of the garden. What is important is a relationship between parts that fit together into a whole. So the Chinese the Chinese garden, the metaphors of show, the Western metaphor of life as the twisted labyrinth, all converge in the celebration of the Qianlong emperor known as Wan Shoujie, or literally the festival of 10,000-year long longevity. As it happens, the emperor's birthday fell on the 13th day of the 8th month of the lunar calendar, just 2 days before the Mid-Autumn Festival, which we all celebrated just last week, right? The Jesuits report that on the 15th day of the 8th month of the lunar calendar, he would host the Mid-Autumn Festival in the European maze. Seated in the middle of the pagoda, he would wait while court maids, imperial consorts, and distinguished guests carrying yellow flower lanterns flitted like innumerable fireflies through the routes and detours of the maze. When they arrived, they would be treated with candy fruits, delicate stuffed dates, and naturally, mooncakes. As Father Attaché describes in the letter, on that day, all of China is illuminated, but the finest illuminations of all are in the emperor's palaces, and particularly in these pleasure grounds. And they're wrought very prettily in the shapes of different fishes, birds, beasts, vase, flowers, fruits, and boats of different sorts and sizes. It would be an endless thing to endeavor to give you a particular account of all these forms, materials, and ornaments. So what's happening? Why does the Qianlong Emperor celebrate his birthday in a maze? So I think that by hosting this festival in the maze with all of its twists and turns, this marks the emperor as the central figure, not only in the state's political cosmology, but in the unfolding cycles of time. Under the full moon, the fire-like dance of young and old, carrying the flickering lanterns, evoke the myriad things in motion, swirling around the sovereign. This time, to wander the labyrinth is not to be lost, but to participate in the grand choreography of dynastic continuity. Imperial largesse is doled out in small, sweet gifts that are quickly consumed. The gesture's significance lies precisely in its ephemerality. 10,000 things in motion, 10,000 points of light and shadows, 10,000 years for the son of heaven. Empires come and go, emperors rise and fall. But for a short while, this nocturnal performance reaffirms Qianlong as the apex of the imperial order. Okay, so our ability to visualize the Chinese Jesuits' maze today rests almost entirely on a suite of 20 copper plate engravings commissioned by the emperor in 1783, based on these drawings of the Chinese court. And these etchings here clearly reflect Western linear perspective. And about 200 copies of these were made, and they're in the Getty Museum, in the V&A, and in the Bibliothèque Nationale in France. And they were given out as gifts to different people. So for the last section of my talk, what I want to think about is the role of European linear perspective in Qing visual culture. In 1735, Nianqi Yao, he actually translated into Chinese Andrea Pozzo. And this is the same Andrea Pozzo who designed the frescoes in the Jesuit church in Rome. Art historians have studied how Castiglione and Chinese artists made for Qianlong a set of trompe-l'oeil detachable murals called scenic illusionary paintings. And depicted in one is this here, which you see, it's in a classic vanishing point. And in the foreground, it's a pool, and then on the sides are these Western buildings. And this is almost an exact reproduction or a recreation of what's happening in Sebastiano Sterlio. I'm sorry, I don't have an image for that. And so this illustrates the painterly fiction of the trompe l'oeil. So, excuse me. So now, why do I want to think about linear perspective, right, in relationship to the Chinese garden and the labyrinth? I think this is also another really important episode in cross-cultural encounters because it is about translation in two ways, linguistic and visual optics. Translating Pozzo's Italian text into Chinese and rendering three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional plane or similar operations of anagogical thinking. Linguistic translation and visual perspective both engage in the transformation of space and world. The science of linear perspective is also a science of epistemology and, by extension, culture, because they're both about fitting in things that are far away from one's field of vision. They both have to do with foreshortening. After all, the Latin meaning of perspectiva is about seeing through. Translation, translatio, is to carry over or carry across. So it seems irresistible then to read this labyrinth, which arose when the Qing Empire was in its apex, was destroyed when it was reaching its terminal nadir, as a mini allegory of the encounter between East and West. What this episode of Cultural Encounters teach us is that, so what does this episode of Cultural Encounter teach us? The Jesuits constructed a little maze for the emperor, true, but they were also trapped in their own maze, and this maze is China itself. By the time that Yuan had burned, the Jesuits had long left China. The Society of Jesus was abolished by the order of the Holy See in 1773. A decade later, they left China. And then in 1860, the Anglo-French troops sacked Yuan, looted its treasures, and set everything on fire. Here you have 12 bronze heads, and these were the same 12 bronze heads that sprouted the jets of water, right? This is what the Qianlong Emperor ordered, and these were taken back to Europe and kept as war trophies. Victor Hugo was so shocked that he wrote, "We call ourselves civilized and them barbarian. Here is what civilization has done to barbarity." Now, and this was actually recreated by this Chinese artist you might have heard of about 10 years ago, and he recreated this, and there are different sets you can find in different places in the world. Excuse me. Okay, so as art historians have pointed out, so this is the Opium War. The Europeans, oh, thank you. The Europeans ironically gave the Chinese garden a second life. After the war, Westerners returned in tours, and they took tons of photographs that depicted the beauty of ruins. They had picnic parties, explored overgrown brambles, and entertained themselves in the shadows of broken palaces. They reflected on the course of history and the twilight of nations, tapping into the deep romance of ruins in the Western imagination. Fragments of great architecture were the fallen allegories of once great empires. Here you can see Hubert Robert, and this is in the 18th century. Athens, Greece, Palmyra, Egypt, and now China. The ascendance of one marks the decline of the other. The dialectic of cultures. Monuments fall into ruins, and then ruins later become monuments. Grass will cover all. Now, these ruins here survive in situ, but as they're represented in paintings, drawings, and photographs, they gain new life. This is what Abivalba calls the Nachleben, the afterlife of antiquity. Here in Yuanmingyuan, the Eastern dynastic decay was captured by the Western technology of the camera. The hue of the sepia already lends the patina of age and nostalgia. Of course, what for some is suffused with the melancholic beauty and prompts philosophical reflection of what the fall of things is to another person a deep sense of humiliation mixed with righteous and nationalistic anger. So whether you think a labyrinth is wonderful or horrifying, again, depends on your perspective. It depends on the vantage point from where you're standing and walking. The Yuanmingyuan, viewed in light of the global poetics of ruins, appear as a double irony. Western monuments in a Chinese landscape destroyed by Western imperialists who themselves had signaled the decline and fall of once mighty empires. Every maze presumes a double perspective. That of the aspirant, and the aspirant is the technical term for maze treaders, whose vision is constricted and partial, and that of the maze viewers, who, through the bird's eye vantage point, sees the artifice whole and entire. So the maze contains its problem and solution in the same view. At the end of the 18th century, Friedrich Schlegel states that everyone has found in the ancients whatever he needed or wished for, especially himself. This is true for the encounter between East and West. Europe takes what it wants from China and rejects the others. China itself takes what it wants from Europe and rejects the others. This is a mirror of our own contemporary age. But the ability to choose this is precisely the very dynamics of cultural exchange. Thank you very much. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much. That was great. I feel like I was wandering through a maze because you take a sharp right or a sharp left every time, and I was like, oh, okay, something new. What I'd like to do, I think, to spare Andrew's voice is maybe take a couple of questions at a time.
Yes, that'd be great. That'd be great.
So if there are any questions, I'll run to you and give you the mic because apparently for the recording, it's important to use the mic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the talk, a very erudite talk. I have actually, I'm curious, when you were talking about Chia Long celebrating his birthday in the Labyrinth, so why is that necessity, that need of, is changing an idea of authority? Is like, is the Qing are trying to create a new basis to develop a different sense of authority that doesn't come from China or Manchu, like to develop like a new idea of empire? Why then suddenly the labyrinth becomes this source of authority?
I think it's both authority and just, oh, sure, of course. Sorry. Okay.
I mean, I have a question that maybe is a kind of a more abstract version of this question. So you call it a hybrid global Baroque.
Right.
Why isn't it a hybrid global Ganying?
Yeah, okay. Right, sure. Okay, a couple more.
But people think
Okay, sure.
maybe they'll.
I think I called it a hybrid global Baroque because it was the Jesuits, and I mean with the Xiang Lo, it's certainly the Western forms imported, and I was thinking from the vantage point of the Jesuits who basically spread their goodness, spread their wealth around, and also just incorporated local indigenous labor as well as materials. But yes, the corollary to that would be a global a Ganying. Back to the question, I think the significance of the Emperor Tianlong in the Western Maze, again, fits into his larger portfolio of a multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multicultural empire. That this was probably not the only celebration he had. He had probably many, right? And he would just kind of cosplay, right? Sometimes he would pretend to be a Tibetan Lama, right? In fact, I was having lunch with one of your colleagues, and he said the Dalai Lama actually grew up with Qianlong in Yuan because he was kind of seen as, I mean, that's what it was a way to kind of synthesize him, and so he was very he was very Buddhist, but one thing he wasn't, he was not very Christian, right? And so my interpretation is also that the maze was really secularized, right? It was evacuated out of its Western spiritual meanings and then incorporated with this new idea of longevity and of wandering, right? Through the Wanwu, through the 10,000 things, and the Wanhua, the 10,000 flowers.
So you already suggested that Chinese classical garden design has a kind of labyrinthian quality to it. And, you know, that labyrinthian quality influenced the English and their garden design, right? When they,
Exactly.
but there strikes me there's something very, very different about that than the maze, the European garden maze that kind of can be, you know, part of it is that you have that perspective, you can see it from above. So I don't know, I just wonder if you could comment on these kind of two very different modes and methods of labyrinthian gardens, I think.
Right. I mean, one is a metaphor and the other is like a real thing, right? And it's, let me just start with the Jardin Anglo-Chinois, and that was actually a revolt against the French classicism, right? With the really the imposition of human geometry and the exactitude, right? So the English were more romantic. It was about the rustic. It was about nature itself, kind of taking shape, and then that was influenced by actually Jesuit letters and William Chambers, who read a lot of Jesuit accounts. And so that's also a really interesting entanglement in that sense, like the British and the Chinese allied forces against the French, right? And but that itself, and then you have Chinese pagodas in British gardens, but that also appeared in other European gardens. So this chinoiserie and this Orientalism appeared in both the more natural versus the classical gardens. But certainly you're right that, I mean, there are lots of things you can say about the Chinese garden, but I was particularly interested in the meandering paths, which is different than a maze because there is no solution. There is like no center to arrive at. But I was also very interested in the geometrical designs of the lattice windows, which are very fractal and geometric, which resemble maze-like patterns. Are there any questions online?
We may have a question online. If we click on the chat button. So the question is, I wonder if the Chinese people were rationalizing the matrix in Yuan when they built the labyrinth, or were just presenting it in a Taoistic manner.
I have to confess that I've never seen The Matrix, so yeah, I just can't. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, maybe this person has some thoughts on The Matrix or the Taoism. I mean, certainly there are Taoist elements in terms of wandering of Yo and also this kind of cosmology of the binaries. So yeah, that's what I have to say. Yeah.
you talked about General Emperor celebrating his birthday in the maze, that's like aha. So that's
Right.
that's one of the ways argument is built. But I was also wondering if there were Jesuit folks or others
Right.
who actually
Yeah. I mean, I haven't, and maybe I just need to do my homework on this. I've done a lot of the Jesuit accounts and what they thought of the gardens, and the next step would really look at Qing. There are tons. I mean, Qing, as you know, is a very bureaucratic empire. They had record keepings, both official as well as unofficial, as well as private. So it would be really interesting to look at. Chandler, I mean, reputedly wrote 40,000 poems. Right, that's almost impossible, like for any human being to do, but he did. So maybe he has some poems on the Western Gardens, and so that would be really interesting. So
Beginning to feel, I have a bad conscience that you're here.
no, I mean, I feel bad that I'm like not.
So when you and I and Professor Whaley Cohen met a little earlier before your talk, one of the questions that we were talking about is how important are the Jesuits? And I guess maybe we should raise that question now. And I think it's in part related to the question that I had, my first question, because it seems to me that your point was that the Jesuits are the ones who are bringing all of this, right? But on the other hand, immigration historians, we had one here somewhere. Talk about push-pull, right? What's more important in this context? The emperor pulling in these new scientists and artists, or the scientists and artists and what they're bringing, especially given the fact that, as you've pointed out, I think these Jesuits are in a certain sense giving up on the mission of mission.
Right. So,
I mean, there's a failure in a certain sense of their original.
I mean, I think were the Jesuits more successful in their missionary activities, they wouldn't be building gardens, but converting souls, right? They would be the fishers of men rather than planting fishes in gardens, right? And so this was part of their overall strategy. Well, let's try to cozy up to the emperor, right? These are the preparatory stages. Let's try all ways possible. We'll give them the best we have: science, technology, aesthetics, philosophy, literature, right? And in a way, they kind of failed in all these different approaches. And so they convert some people. They wanted to convert the emperor himself. That never happened. And so they were left into this. I mean, they thought of themselves in their account as really the emperor's intimates and his kind of advisors. But in a way, like new scholarship has shown that the Qing court emperor operated in what is called a boy system. This is this Manchu word, which basically meant like one of like the bondage system, in which they were kept as like more like master servants, right? They were kind of, in a way, like they were gilded prisoners, right? Because they couldn't convert, right? They couldn't go into the countryside, right? And so they were just used as advisors or like gardeners, right? Or like mechanics, right?
Sounds like the Jesuits are lost in a labyrinth of their own making.
Well,
Wah, wah. I think I want to give Andrew a break at this point. So let's thank him for, as it was put, a wonderfully erudite talk.
right. Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry that I'm not in my top form, but please email me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to continue. Many of you probably know about this topic in Chinese history much better than I do, but thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight. Can I, go ahead and clap another round?